Good morning, everybody. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the 15th Annual Personalized Medicine Conference at Harvard Medical School. The first conference's tagline in 2005 was "The Promise of Personalized Medicine." Although there were many skeptics back then regarding personalized medicine's promise, we believed then, as we do now, that personalized medicine represents an opportunity to transform healthcare based on new discoveries and developments in science and technology, including, not least, the mapping of the human genome. In 2005, there were very few products on the market that we could refer to as personalized. But 15 years ago, we did foresee a future in which drugs could be targeted to only those for whom they work, in which one could map a patient's DNA within a few weeks at a cost of under $1,000, thereby providing a powerful new diagnostic tool for research and clinical care, and in which science-based intelligent choices would, over time, enable us to construct a system that would protect and prevent illness before it occurred. Clearly, especially with regard to the last point, we're not there yet. But equally clearly, enormous and measurable progress has been made. Whereas in 2005, there were only 13 personalized medicine products on the market, today there are over 170 drugs with biomarker references on their respective labels. Moreover, as our report with LEK published 2 weeks ago showed, 55% of all oncology trials today are guided by biomarker strategies, which is up from 15% in 2000. In addition, the first cell and gene therapies, which may be considered the ultimate personalized medicines, have come onto the market after years of research and development, demonstrating the viability of immunotherapy and gene therapy to transform lives. In 2005, both were little more than chimeras on the horizon. PMC argued in 2005, as we do now, that as daunting as the scientific challenges underpinning personalized medicine are, equally challenging is the imperative to change the one-size-fits-all medical paradigm that we have inherited into one that embraces the principle of linking sophisticated diagnostics to more informed therapeutic decisions. Regulation, reimbursement, and the process of clinical adoption need to be reformed before personalized medicine can become standard of care. And it is these challenges that have brought us here today at a critical moment when issues like cost, affordability, and access dominate public discussion about healthcare, unfortunately without much reference to personalized medicine. This is something we would like to change if we can, because we do stand at the entryway of a new era in medicine, which is, as often said, the right patient gets the right treatment at the right time. It is obvious that science and technology alone are not going to allow us to cross the threshold of that new era. And it is those challenges between the science and the patient that we are going to discuss in a systematic way today and tomorrow at this conference. But we do not want to lament the barriers, or we do not only want to lament the barriers that personalized medicine faces. We also want to propose solutions that will propel our effort to create a friendlier environment that accelerates its development and delivery. We have titled this conference, "The Paradigm Evolves," in keeping with our contention that while we are making progress, there is more that collectively we can do. And that is what this conference is about. I especially want to call your attention to the final 2 sessions of the conference tomorrow afternoon. First is the Harvard Business School case study, which Richard Hammermesh is going to teach on the Dementia Discovery Fund. The question is, how does one raise sufficient capital to meet a medical need when the return on investment is not altogether obvious? Actually, that question will run through many of the conference discussions, including Stephen Eck's interview in a few minutes with Karl Jule on immunotherapy. And second, in a panel comprising multiple stakeholders under the direction of Bill Dalton, we will ask, how can we nudge organized medicine in a direction that promotes personalized medicine, that actually puts patients and their needs first when we have so many siloed stakeholders in the healthcare system? We saved the best for last and hope that you will join those two conversations. I would be remiss if I did not pause to thank the people who made this conference possible, beginning first with our 40 sponsors whose generosity allows PMC both to organize this conference, but also carry on our work in education, advocacy, and evidence development throughout the year. So I hope you'll visit the booths that are on the first floor, but also the second floor for the first time this year. And although we will not leave this august venue, we have, just for your information, run out of space for exhibitors. So please, please visit their respective booths. Although they were too numerous to call out individually, the sponsors will be highlighted multiple times throughout the conference, and obviously they're on the screen at the moment. I want to make sure, though, that no one misses this evening's cocktail reception at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, which is only a few blocks from here, and it is sponsored by Intermountain Precision Genomics, and I especially want to thank them for that. Second, I want to thank PMC's advisory committee that oversaw the conference construction. Their names are listed in the program, and we couldn't have put together this conference without them. And third, I want to thank PMC's staff, Cynthia Benz, David Davenport, Nicole Jacobson, Darrell Pritchard, Priscilla Sampson, Kayla Smith, Lindsay Stevens, Chris Wells, and the Ogilvy team. Please join me in thanking them. This really was a team effort. And finally, I want to thank Raju Kushalapati, the Paul C. Cabot Professor of Genetics at Harvard Medical School, for conceiving of this conference 15 years ago, for inviting PMC to partner with him in launching and sustaining it, and then 4 years ago for handing it off to us to run without adult supervision. This conference would not exist were it not for Raju, who has graciously agreed to welcome us to Harvard Medical School this morning. Raju.
Thank you, Ed. On behalf of all of my colleagues here at Harvard Medical School and the affiliated hospitals, and my friends here, Kathy Giusti and Richard Hammermesh from the Business School, I want to welcome all of you to this historical 15th annual meeting of personalized medicine. Since you're all a captive audience here for the next few minutes, I want to take the opportunity to boast a little bit about the role that the greater Boston metropolitan area has and continues to make contributions to personalized medicine. Even before the name personalized medicine was in existence, there were already great scientific efforts that started here, the beginning with Wally Gilbert's development of DNA sequencing technologies that are followed by George Church's new development of technologies that really made it possible to launch the Human Genome Sequencing Project in the 1990s. When the Human Genome Project was launched in 1990, then Eric Lander at MIT was one of the first genome centers that helped actually develop the plans for mapping and sequencing the human genome. And Eric and his team here, and I had a little part, but I was in New York at that time, we all had the privilege of being a part of the Human Genome Project that truly revolutionized the way that we think about human biology and also launched personalized medicine. And that effort continues here at the Broad Institute where Eric leads. And his group has been involved with the Human Genome Variation Project. And then later on, many of us, including myself, had the privilege of being a part of the Cancer Genome Atlas program that provided us with information about the genetic and genomic profiles of cancer. That also is revolutionizing the way that we treat cancer patients. So those are just a little bit of a sort of a scientific aspect of this stuff. But there are other things that actually the Boston area is really well known for. And Boston was one of the first regions where a company started a program to create personalized medicine, and that was Genzyme, now became part of Sanofi. And all of you recognize that Henry Tenmier, who sadly passed away, was the founder of Genzyme. And he was the first one to think about lysosomal storage disorders and gene replacement therapy that truly revolutionized the way that you take care of certain kinds of childhood disorders. And it was the first time also that it was shown that diseases that have a relatively low frequency in the population and trying to get effective treatments could create significant amount of value for the companies. And when the company was sold to Sanofi, if I remember correctly, it was valued at about $70 billion. And other areas of scientific enterprise that moved into the translation, it came from the Cancer Genome Atlas project. And one of the offshoots of that is the development of new types of cancer diagnostics. And one of the first companies that started that effort is Foundation Medicine. And Mike Pellini is here, who's the architect of Foundation Medicine. And he and his team have revolutionized the way that we treat cancer patients by the kinds of tests that he has developed. And when Foundation Medicine was acquired by Roche, that was valued, if I remember correctly, about $5 billion. Very significant levels of accomplishments. Other types of things that have really happened is that other types of genetic disorders for which people really thought was impossible to be able to try to develop therapies. Vertex here has launched a program to try to think of curing patients with cystic fibrosis. And as all of you know, initially they developed a drug to treat a particular subgroup of patients of cystic fibrosis that contained the delta 508 mutation and how to treat them. And now they've expanded that program to be able to extend the lives of those patients very significantly. So, and you all know of other exciting things, that scientific discoveries that also changed and had a very important impact on personalized medicine. And one of them that was an effort that was done both at Dana-Farber and Brigham and Women's Hospital and MGH was the discovery that it is possible to identify lung cancer patients who are most likely to respond to tyrosine kinase inhibitors, and this happened in 2004. And in my way of thinking, maybe biased, is that this is the start of the new personalized medicine, and that discovery actually, I think, launched the way that we think about personalized medicine today, and also resulted in the change of label for the drugs, and that's one of the first, not the first, but among the more important, personalized medicine drugs and therapies. And that all of these things have really changed, and also changed clinical practice. And Dana-Farber and Brigham and Women's Hospital made a very significant commitment, to personalized medicine in cancer, and they developed panels of genes that are sequenced both for solid tumors and hematologic malignancies. And today, virtually every new patient that comes into the clinic at Dana-Farber, whatever the kind of tumor that has been diagnosed, their tumor is profiled with one of these panels, and all the clinical decisions, or most of the clinical decisions, are based upon the information that's obtained from that. And that obviously has a clear impact and a model for how to implement personalized medicine in the clinical setting. Finally, I would just want to say a few words about this meeting. And we're also very proud to actually have played a part in the starting of the Personalized Medicine Coalition. In 1993, we started a company here, and I'm pleased to be a part of that company called Millennium Pharmaceuticals, now became part of Takeda. And that company, many years later, decided that it wants to have an office in Washington, D.C., and when they established such an office in Washington, D.C., they wanted to be able to try to bring people together to really talk about genetics and the role of genetics in disease. And this had the origins of Personalized Medicine Coalition. And so we're very proud of the fact that we had a little part to play in the founding of Personalized Medicine Coalition. And finally, as Ed pointed out, we always thought that we needed to have a collaboration between academia and industry and policy groups to be able to promote personalized medicine. And when we first started the meeting, it was a collaboration between Harvard Medical School, Harvard Business School, several of the hospitals, Personalized Medicine Coalition, and now Ogilvy, which is an advertising company. All of us together were happy to be able to start this conference, and we're so pleased that the conference is able to sort of move towards where it is today. So as I try to illustrate, the promotion of personalized medicine requires science, it requires translational medicine, it requires physicians and healthcare providers, it requires business, it requires both biotech and pharmaceutical industry and regulation in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. And I'm also very proud, for example, in terms of policy, that at the State House in Massachusetts has created a special caucus, a bipartisan caucus, that is focused on thinking about precision medicine and how implementation of precision medicine in Massachusetts is going to help our population. So, and one other thing I also want to point out, special attention to Richard Hammermesh and Kathy Giusti, who run the CRAFT Precision Medicine program at Harvard Business School. And they were architects of this program and bring a very unique perspective about how to promote precision medicine with the help of the Kraft family and their support. So it's wonderful to be able to have all of these different fields together. And the goal of this meeting has always been to try to bring all of these different kinds of people together and have them engage in a conversation, and most importantly, for everybody to make new friends. And I hope you will be able to make new friends at this meeting and enjoy it. And thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Raju. Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to introduce Stephen Eck, the chairman of the Personalized Medicine Coalition, who has a distinguished career in personalized medicine, starting at the University of Pennsylvania, where he was on the faculty and a colleague of Karl Jule, and then going on to large pharma, working at Pfizer, Lilly, and Astellas, and now as Chief Medical Officer of a small biotech in the immunotherapy space. So he's the perfect person to introduce our kickoff speaker, Karl Jule. So, Stephen.
Thank you, Ed. It's great to be here. It's a terrific annual event, and we're going to start with something totally different. I come from the small molecule world, which is certainly well understood, and now we're moving to a completely different area where we make custom drugs for people on demand to meet their particular circumstances. And this was a totally unorthodox way of thinking not that very long ago. So I'm joined today by Karl Jule, who's professor of pathology and laboratory medicine at University of Pennsylvania. He heads their cellular immunotherapy program, and he's one of the leaders and pioneers in the field of turning T cells into patients' drugs. So I thought we'd use this time. We have about 45 minutes. I'd like to divide it between sort of where the field is, so everyone is sort of caught up and where the field's going, and then move to the more controversial topics about how do we finance this, what are the public health implications, and how do we manage this. And then I want to leave time, a good 15 minutes for you all to ask questions, because I think that's a really important part of this conference, and is to get everyone engaged and off to a fun start. So, Karl, why don't we start with just generally where you see the field and where you see it going?
Thanks, Steve. And first of all, I want to thank Raj and Ed for organizing this. And I think clearly, I mean, CAR T cells are the ultimate right now in personalized therapy, and it's a disruptive event and requires a lot of changes. So it's right in the theme of this. A little bit of history is that, we first began treating patients with CAR T cells in 1997, and those patients actually had HIV. And we were doing that at that point because there were no integrase inhibitors and so on, and that people died of the immunodeficiency. And we found we could repair the immune system in those patients, and we now have just submitted an abstract of where this is quite remarkable because the FDA's database, where people on a gene transfer protocol, you follow them, for 15 years. And so we followed those patients. The first 18 we treated, and we just submitted an abstract. We have follow-up now from 1997 on 15 out of those 18 patients. They all still have CAR T cells, and they're all well. I mean, they're now on therapy for their HIV, but their immune system is healthy. The CAR T cells have survived for decades, and there's no autoimmunity. There's none of the awful things that could happen with gene manufacturing and genetic engineering. So that's, we then began treating patients with cancer with CAR T cells in 2010. And the initial patients had chronic lymphocytic leukemia that was chemotherapy refractory. All 3 patients responded, and 2 out of those 3 now are disease-free and still have CAR T cells like our HIV patients did after a single infusion. And they have no leukemia. I mean, we have very sensitive, deep sequencing of the bone marrow, and that clone has gone at very deep levels. So I think we can say 2 out of those 3 patients are probably cured 9 years down. Now, the liability they have is they still have ongoing B-cell aplasia because the CAR T cells are still working and still target, they don't tell the difference between a normal B cell and a leukemic B cell. We have found now that that's an acquired immunodeficiency. It's more severe in children than adults, because adults have had a lot of infections, and their plasma cells that make the memory antibodies are CD19 negative, so they're spared. And so our adults don't require anything except observation. The children need gamma globulin replacement therapy because they haven't, built up that immune memory. So that there's a lot of room for more innovation. But the idea that you could have a so-called living drug, I think, is now established both in cancer patients, at least with leukemia and lymphoma, and chronic infections. So there's a lot of runway for new kinds of therapies. So, based on just those 3 patients in 2011, then we reported them, and now they're 9 years on. But back then, we had the first real mechanism of action. We could show correlation between the proliferation of the CAR cells, tumor lysis syndrome, cytokine release syndrome, and then eradication of the leukemia clones. And so Novartis called us up and said, what about commercializing this? And we had never even thought, no one thought it was possible in 2012. And now we have a whole industry around that. I've been told there's more than 50 biotechs right here in the Cambridge, Kendall Square area now doing cell therapies. So it was a disruptive change based on 3 patients. And it's completely changed a lot of our approaches. Probably the biggest issue now scientifically is, can we move beyond hematologic malignancies? And there's a lot of work on that. In animals, you can. Engineered T cells work in solid cancers, but it's more complex, and we can talk a lot about those.
So Karl, the regulatory environment for gene therapy has changed a lot from the early days in the 90s when it first took off to where we are today. How has this evolved, and what are the continuing needs for the regulatory environment to make this commercially doable and accessible to everyone?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting area, Steve. There's been hype and hysteria when you have gene modification. Would there be all kinds of Frankensteins created and so on? And so it's not dissimilar to the Asilomar conference many years ago where they went with DNA cloning. And educated people made different decisions then. Harvard decided to get out of that back, remember? And then, but other places went ahead and worked on recombinant DNA engineering, and then the fields matured. So we have now the issues of, genetic engineering. We have orthogonally things like CRISPR-Cas9 engineering. The ability to make synthetic immune systems is much more than I would have imagined back in 2010. So it's a huge issue. And there are 2 main things that, we have the regulatory thing, which is the FDA never evolved with the idea of an ultra-personalized therapy and the standards you have in that compared to something that's, a small molecule, which, as you know, is a very different beast than a manufactured single patient N of 1 therapy. So the FDA has been as forthcoming as they can, but the regulations are very different on that. Another thing that's become evident is that for the first time, I think, the drug life cycle of these, basically it's right now, it's an engineered T cell, which has been shown safe in more than 1,000 patients now. We've never had, a genetically modified T cell transform. So that's different than stem cells, where that has happened in some highly publicized trials. So there's a cell type specific safety issue. Post-thymic T cells are very safe, and in fact, you can try to make them turn into a leukemia cell, a T cell leukemia, and it's very difficult. So there is cell type specificity when you do genetic engineering. But the basic backbone now of an engineered T cell has been shown safe. And so there's now all kinds of innovation. And for the first time, I think, in the biopharma industry, patent duration won't matter. It's become more like cell phones and stuff, where Qualcomm can have patents and so on the chips. But new cell phones come out every 2 years if you want to have a competitive product. So we have that now with the cell and gene therapy thing, where new things are coming on in innovation. And so in a pharma, how do you manage that? It's a very different patent management strategy. It's different And innovation has to be the driver, I think. And then the FDA is not equipped to handle that kind of rapid drug cycle management. I mean, so that's going to be a bottleneck, I think. It's very difficult because they never had that kind of turnaround, with registrations and so on. And how do we have, how do we follow patients, get safety data banks and so on.
So you've talked about the expansion in the field, the number of players that have entered this, perhaps somewhat unexpectedly. The biotech industry, large pharma here in the U.S. and elsewhere, certainly a tremendous amount of work in China. Where do you see this going? Will these diverse sectors harmonize? Will there be some regulatory standards? With so many people doing so many different things, does that produce more opportunity or just more risk?
So I think, hopefully it's driven by science, and the regulatory science needs to evolve. We didn't used to have that, I think. And so there's a real dissociation between the amount of people with experience in this field and now that's a vacuum that's going to be filled by people who get experience. And I mean, it's clearly worldwide. There's more actual trials and companies and investment in China now than there are here in the U.S. It all started here in the U.S., but China has. I've just come back from there. It's incredible because it's both government-backed and then VC-backed, and so we need to really pay attention to that at a national level. China's always been looked at sort of as a Me Too market. And now, for the first time, they're driving innovation, I think. So that's an interesting issue, and can we have worldwide harmonization? Last fall, there was that highly publicized event where basically illegally and ethically unsupportable, genome editing was done at a vertical level to engineer fetuses. And that happened in China. It was done illegally, but we need to make sure that doesn't happen because that could really stymie the whole field. So having harmonization between Europe and Asia and the U.S. is really important.
So to that point, traditionally U.S. medical societies, the AACR and ASCO and ABA and AHA and a whole collection of initials, they've been the sort of guardians of the standards and have driven physician communities toward best practices. Do you see this happening? Is the right level of engagement there to not to police it, but more or less to guide the field at the patient level so that we get to best practices?
Yeah, I mean, so that is happening, and it's happening at different rates, for instance, in Europe than it is here. It's hard to know one example is what happened with bone marrow transplantation. So as you know, that started out as an academic. There were never INDs, and it evolved in the academic world, and the FDA did not regulate it. They made a decision back with gene transfer that this would be, engineered cells would be regulated. So if it's more than minimally manipulated, the standard is the FDA requires that it be done under INDs. And so can it go to the level like of Red Cross, blood transfusion medicine, or will it be central pharma manufacturing? And I think over time, right now the FDA has come down with a position that we require central manufacturing and pharma level control. But I think there's going to come, not in in less than 5 years, we'll have the ability to do point of care in this. And then it's more like a transfusion medicine business where, at a local hospital, patients can have blood drawn, cells manufactured there, and just reinfused. So that then requires a very different oversight. And if there's comfort by that time, I think that will happen. That there'll be certifications. We need, for instance, validated processes on, transduction of cells. And if you have an error rate that's sigma, 6 sigma or something, I think that will be acceptable in cancer. So the point of care will really change things. Right now, our manufacturing is done in the industry with the technologies. Basically, my lab started in the 1990s, and it hasn't been advanced. There's many new engineering approaches that could make it safe. The issues of product identity, contamination, and so on, basically eliminated with proper engineering.
So from the small molecule or even recombinant protein side, large companies and biotech companies are obliged to and do well pharmacovigilance, following their products on the market and reporting outcomes, and the labels evolve over time. If this does evolve to a point of care, say your product is made at your local hospital in their blood bank, how do we do pharmacovigilance? How is that outbred system going to inform the public when things go wrong?
So that's a good question. There's been asymmetry in that gene and cell therapy have been overregulated compared to small molecules where there's a bigger history. So it's well known to oncologists that if you get cytotoxic chemotherapy for breast or ovarian cancer, you have a 5 or 10% chance of getting leukemia later, from genotoxicity. And we don't have forward-looking registries on that. But the cell and gene therapy, we do have that because it had a separate regulation that would follow people. So I think the pharmacovigilance needs to be made standard across all therapies and not just, it's asymmetric like it is now. And I think, so we need to have that ongoing registry, even when it becomes point of care. So that needs to be built into the system. It's really important because the long-term risk really of the kind of engineered cell therapy we're doing right now is not, it's turned out it's not leukemia or genotoxicity. It's probably going to be autoimmunity. And we won't know that long-term risk unless patients are followed.
Let's turn to the issues of pricing, reimbursement, and access. These therapies aren't cheap. They're not cheap to manufacture. There's a lot of logistics on the delivery side. I'm not sure any of the companies are making much money in this business yet. Certainly in talking with hospitals and healthcare organizations, often these are money-losing. How does that change? That's not sustainable if we have multiple products of this type. So what needs to change for this to make this more affordable or more generally accessible without subsidy?
So, it's a complex issue. You need to break it down into the different parts. I mean, one is the actual cost of goods. And right now with the N of 1 therapies with CAR T cells, for instance, the main cost driver is human labor. So automation clearly could make a big change in the cost of goods. And I think that's certain to happen. There was no industry before to try to, drive cell therapy efficiency and so on. And it just will evolve just like it has for recombinant proteins. So I think that's a given. But then when the cost of goods goes down, I mean, we have an issue, probably the worst place to open up a new therapy is the United States healthcare system, because it's the fragmentation. And
I'm sorry to hear that.
so, I mean, that's a way above our pay grade thing that needs political adjustment on how to deliver care, pay for performance type things and all those. So once the cell manufacturing issues are worked out, the complex logistics and so on, then it enters the rest of the things, some of which Raj was talking about. What do you do in orphan diseases? How do you set pricing and so on? As an anecdote, I was in Brussels last month where after a talk, one of the physicians came up and said they were going to treat a 25-year-old with leukemia who was actually a medical student the very next day. And so I said, great, this is a Novartis product, which I've worked with them a long time on that. And so I said, Novartis has opened up a manufacturing plant in Leipzig, Germany. I said, is that how you did it? And they said, no. In this case, the patient was apheresed in Brussels, and then they flew the cells to Morris Plains, New Jersey, manufactured, froze them, and sent them back to Brussels. And so that obviously is a very complex logistics. It takes time to scale this out. So it's happening, but we have an unknown time frame of how long it will take.
So before we go to a Q&A session, maybe we could talk about where this field evolves therapeutically. You talked about HIV as where it got its start, and then now it's entirely in cancer and in various embodiments, and solid tumors are certainly big on the horizon. But beyond cancer, what else are T cells good for?
So, as you know, I mean, almost every chronic disease has a touch point with the immune system, whether it's dementia, whether it's cardiac disease, and autoimmunity. Maybe 15 or 20% of the population has autoimmunity at some level, and from systemic or organ specific. So, the really exciting thing is that engineered cells, T cells and other kinds of cells, can dial down the immune system as well as turn it on. So I think in chronic infections and cancers, I mean, we'll see many, many different advances happen. But there are now several companies and trials underway to dial down the immune system. We've worked with Bruce Blazer at the University of Minnesota and shown that graft versus host disease can be prevented using engineered cord blood regulatory T cells, for instance. And there are trials now looking at diabetes, solid organ transplants, and so on. So I think that will happen. And, you know, the holy grail has been, can you get away from daily immunosuppression and have, you know, curative therapies for autoimmune disease, which is, you know, striking that, you know, when I was in medical school, we didn't know the cause of cancer. And then, as we mentioned, you know, we learned how to sequence the genome, and now you can actually engineer, you know, cures. But for autoimmune disease, we don't have that yet. And it's the, you know, huge part of our national health budget. And I hope, you know, I'm sure there's going to be lots of innovation there to get there.
Okay, so let's open it up to the audience. I know we've covered a lot of territory, but I'm sure you have very specific questions you'd like to hear addressed. So we're happy to entertain your questions. While we're waiting for the audience, we've talked about mainly T-cell focused therapies, but that's sort of, you know, one niche. Do you foresee that other cells were going to be manipulated ex vivo and transplanted, or will we get to in vivo transduction of cells where it's not manufactured outside the body?
So, I mean, I think that it's really a blue sky thing where all the bone marrow derived cells you can genetically engineer, and you can find vulnerabilities you can correct. I think one of the huge things that will happen will be the cure of sickle cell anemia. You know, we've known which codon needs to be changed for sickle cell anemia, and that technology exists now. And for the first time, instead of a lethal disease that's extraordinarily expensive, we're going to be able to cure that with engineered stem cells. And there's many other examples like that. There will be, you know, natural killer cells, dendritic cells, et cetera. So macrophages. We have one of my graduate students recently just started a company where he makes CAR-Macs. So they're CAR molecules put in macrophages, and then the macrophages, phagocytose, basically eat tumor cells. So T cells kill with cytolytic effects. Macrophages do it by phagocytosis. So there's all kinds of innovation that's going to be very exciting to watch.
Great.
Good morning, John Armstrong from dermatology company Galderma. You were talking about the challenges facing us for applying CAR T therapy to autoimmune diseases, and I know they're large. There's work done by Amy Payne on the development of a CAR T therapy for a derm disorder called bullous pemphigoid, where you have to know what the autoantigen is, in this case desmoglein 3, but for the vast majority, all but that one, we don't know what the autoantigen is. Is there another approach you're thinking for making this therapy applicable to autoimmune disease?
So, I mean, that's a really exciting thing. Don Siegel, who's here, actually made part of those. They're called chimeric autoantigen receptor T cells, so CAAR T cells. And that trial will begin, you know, sometime next year to see if, in that case, bullous pemphigoid, where the known antigen and antibody thing could be interrupted. So that will be kind of a proof of concept. But I think, you know, as we, you know, the famous saying, you know, Richard Feynman said, you know, unless you can take it apart and put it back together again, you can't really understand it. Yeah. And so there's some autoimmune diseases we understand what causes them, like bullous pemphigoid, but there are others we don't. And so once we understand, I think there will be engineering approaches then for most of them. And the fact that you can regrow skin now is a huge thing. So I think many corrective gene therapies will happen, and it's just very exciting to watch that happen now.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Stephen Wicks from the Colorado Center for Personalized Medicine. I wanted to ask what kind of regulatory regime you envisage, because I'm kind of scared by the kind of local manufacture. As a former inspector, I've seen some quite scary things, so I just wondered what you think about the kind of thing in the future.
So obviously, I mean, we need control systems where they're validated. So I see it mostly as an engineering problem. I mean, the main issue if you make personalized cells, really it's chain of custody and identification. Because if you give the wrong cells to the wrong patient, they'll likely get a very bad graft versus host disease. So, but we already do that in transfusion medicine. And, two people sign off, accept a barcode. There's ways to make it really foolproof. And so that has to happen. But beyond that, I think we can have validated systems so that there's still regulation there, but we need the systems that are being built but don't yet exist.
Do you see it as a light touch or more of a kind of regulated inspection system?
Well, I think, what I didn't mention is there's kind of two ways the field's going. One's going to be with, autologous cells, which have a lot of advantage of safety and, they can last a long time and not do mischief in a patient. At least they haven't so far. And then the other approach now is third-party cells, where it's much more in a pharma model, and they could be engineered from cord blood or iPSCs. And then those will be off the shelf and be frozen and probably sitting in pharmacies ready to go. So it's the ultra-personalized ones will really benefit from local manufacturing, and we need to see what role the off-the-shelf kinds of engineered cells have.
Thank you.
So you referenced the current blood banking procedures as evidence that this could go forward safely, but there's a fundamental difference between blood banking and what we're headed toward. Red cell transfusion is a pretty vanilla topic. I mean, it's the same thing over and over. And here you're talking about you're going to, in principle, be doing one thing infrequently. I mean, you're not going to see an ALL patient every day. And so how do you maintain standards when you have such a diverse portfolio of potential products? Any one hospital, take Lancaster General in your backyard, they're not, they're sort of an academic center, they're affiliated with you, they know how to deliver good care. But they're going to have a very outbred patient population, and if we're treating skin disorders and cancers and HIV on any one day or any one week, they're not going to be doing much of anything twice. And that would seem to be a good opportunity for mishap.
Yeah. So, I mean, you can't gloss over the history of, red blood cell transfusion initially wasn't so routine until Landsteiner figured out how to do blood typing. So it was initially not a good thing a lot of times. So I think we're at that level where it's evolving, and so you need to get trained people. There's always going to be this inverse zip code rule where if you're close to innovative centers, there'll be better outcomes and people who are trained and know how to do things. Whereas out in rural America, there's a whole generational problem, I think. So implementing it there is very different than here in Kendall Square or something. So, and so that's a type 2 translational issue of how to move it out into rural areas, where I think you're right. I mean, it's much more of a problem. But I mean, right now it's, acute leukemia, but just in a year from now, probably it's going to be myeloma. The most common heme malignancy will be FDA approved with CAR T cells. And so that's frequent, and places need to learn how to do that if it's going to be delivered efficiently. And so we have an issue it's really across all of healthcare of how to have innovative therapies move into the community. That's not unique to cell and gene therapy.
Zen.
Yes. Hi, Jen Mahoney from Asuragen. I wonder if you could comment on what kind of diagnostic innovation needs to happen to move this whole ecosystem forward.
So it's, I didn't really mention, but it's kind of like hand in glove. For cancer going forward, it's not just, cancer genome sequencing and epigenetics need to be known, but the whole immune system needs to be bookmarked and tested in patients at diagnosis, because that is going to be used in designing the right therapy for a given patient. So this is an evolving area of diagnostics that didn't exist before, whether it's liquid biopsies, whether it's genomics, epigenomics, but both not just in the case of a cancer, but as well as the patient's immune system. So we found you can predict very highly in chronic lymphocytic leukemia at the time you draw blood from them, who you can actually successfully manufacture CAR cells and who will be cured and who won't be. So then you could avoid an expensive manufacturing and futile effort and go maybe straight to some other kind of therapy, maybe with third-party cells. So that's an evolving area, and we need that space, as well as cell manufacturing and then the science and engineering.
Thank you.
One area we haven't talked about is product liability, and I know you have some views on this. Certainly for your typical small molecule or biologic, companies carry a fair amount of liability risk from either real or perceived injury. How do you manage liability on a product that has only been made once?
Class action lawsuits actually started in Philadelphia, and the term Philadelphia lawyer happened, and it all was actually because when the polio vaccine came out. And Paul Offit's written some really great books about that. What happened was they had recombinant poliovirus. It was not fully attenuated, and some kids getting a polio vaccine got neurotropic polio and ended up on iron lungs. So that was a huge class action lawsuit, and the first examples of those. The actual unforeseen benefit of an ultra-personalized cell therapy is there's no class action lawsuit. So it's N of one. So to that extent, there can be lower liability. Now you can always have some problem, like if you have a recombinant lentivirus or whatever that has recombinant, it's not error-proof that way. But I think this is one area that's unforeseen where it's probably lower liability for the pharma industry.
You wrote an editorial recently, which we chatted about, on a publication that came out of some research done in China. And I think one of your comments in the editorial was, the most important thing about this paper is what it doesn't say. Would you care to comment on that, or just maybe describe the paper a little bit and what the issues that pointed out?
Yeah, so that was a single case study of a young 23-year-old in China who had two sequential diagnoses, maybe 3 months apart, one being acute leukemia and then HIV/AIDS. And so they used that as an opportunity to try to replicate the Berlin patient, where 10 years ago, a patient in Berlin had acute leukemia and then got a transplant from a cord blood patient who was identical in the chromosome 6 area for HLA, but also had on another chromosome a very unusual thing, which is about 5% of Caucasians had. It had the null delta 32 mutation of CCR5, which means you cannot infect it with HIV. So they gave that patient a transplant with that, and were able to then, he's the first patient to be said cured. We have a second patient this year where that just reported in Nature now, where because of this fortuitous outcome of using a genetically matched product that's also naturally HIV resistant, the patient then eradicated that. So they did this successfully in China, where they tried to engineer using CRISPR-Cas9 technology the delta 32 mutation. So they found an HLA-matched cord blood donor and then knocked out CCR5, did the transplant, and got nice reconstitution, but it was only about 8%. The efficiency was not high enough, and the patient still has HIV. and his leukemia went away. So the issue there was not enough feasibility, the manufacturing part was not enough to really test that hypothesis. But, that's just an example of things that could be done. I mentioned sickle cell anemia, where we're going to be able to fix that with, I think, autologous cells. And so it's very exciting, the fact that you can now, engineer a stem cell and then have it regraft, and then all the lineages came out of that. So that's shown now for years follow-up, and no side effects. And the big issue's been, are there off-target edits and so on, and they didn't find them.
In an N of 1.
N of 1. Yep.
Stephen. One more question.
One more, okay.
Yeah.
One more question. So you've described the, I'm looking at the clock down here, so your clock doesn't
The
match.
clocks are not synced.
Oh, thank you. I like that clock. So, we talked about the affordable issues and the profitability issues now, and then you described this wonderful future state where you can get it at your corner hospital. How do you get from A to B? I mean, that's a very nice place to be in the future, but it's not clear how you fund that gap.
Yeah, so one thing that's really clear is that it depends on what society you're in. So Europe is very cautious in this area, and they're way behind if you look at clinicaltrials.gov and the activity here. And it's going to take longer there. I mean, China is ahead of us, and I mean, it's like the Wild West. And
Wild East, I think they're East.
Wild East, I guess. So, but the fact is, we'll probably learn from them. And I think we have more of a science-driven approach. And so getting from A to B is going to be a set of, you walk before you run. And it will happen at leading medical centers and then be translated into the community. So how you fund it is a very different issue now. I mean, it's how do you integrate it into our healthcare system, as you mentioned in the beginning, is probably the hardest question now.
Okay.
So,
Let's stop here and
I was going to say, please join me in thanking Karl and Stephen. We're going to transition now into a panel led by Mike Paolini. Mike is the managing partner of a venture capital firm called Section 32. He's also a member of the Personalized Medicine Coalition Board, and he's going to continue this discussion and lead us through a conversation on disruptive technologies and personalized medicine. So, Mike, please introduce your panel.
All right, sounds good. I might sit down at the ends. Let's all come up. Good. All right, let's kick it off. I'll introduce the panel in a moment, or rather I'll likely have them introduce themselves in a little bit of detail. First of all, I want to thank Ed and the PMC, not just for putting this conference together each year, but frankly for the work that they do on behalf of our industry over the course of 12 months every single year. They don't have hundreds of people, to say the least, but they get a tremendous amount done. And so for those of you who aren't active with the coalition on an ongoing basis, I'd certainly encourage you to get active. And also I want to thank Raju for his comments on Foundation Medicine. I think what you heard from Raju is that this industry requires a team effort, and whether it's Foundation Medicine or any of these other companies, they really do require a tremendous effort, not just from the folks inside the company, but from the folks all around, especially people sitting in this room today. So for the past several years, I've actually been a moderator or part of a panel that ended the conference, the last slot on the second day. Now, Ed told me every year, Mike, I'm saving the best for last, but I was, I'm a little bit smarter than that to just buy that one. So what I'm going to do today is really take advantage of moderating the first panel of the day. I'm going to do that in two ways. Number one, instructions to the panelists. Disregard the clock. If we want to continue on, we'll continue on as long as we'd like to do so. And then the second thing I'm going to do is, when I finish at the end of the conference, I feel like I always have to finish on an incredibly upbeat note. I'm going to take a bit of a more measured approach today to the introductory comments. because I think it's important that we acknowledge the challenges, but then, hopefully spend the next couple of days figuring out, starting with this panel, how we are going to overcome the inherent challenges that we face every single day. So I'm going to start with just by reading an excerpt from an editorial that Dr. Azra Raza, who's a professor at Columbia University School of Medicine, she wrote this editorial in the Wall Street Journal about 2 months ago, so I'm going to read it. It's titled, "We Need a New Start." She says, "I've been studying and treating cancer for 35 years, and here's what I know about the progress made in that time. There has been far less than it appears. Despite some advances, the treatment for most kinds of cancer continue to be too painful, too damaging, too expensive, and too ineffective. The same three methods, surgery, chemo, and radiotherapy, have prevailed for half a century." And I would say it's not just cancer. What about psychiatric disorders? What about autoimmune disorders, rheumatologic conditions, as we just heard from Dr. June? Neurologic disorders, infectious disease, wellness. Should I continue? The list goes on. The irony is, as many challenges as we face in advancing the needle, advancing the ball in cancer care, I think we've done the best in oncology over the course of the past decade. Now, I'm actually way more optimistic than Dr. Raza, and I think virtually everyone in this room is more optimistic than that. Especially, now I work with a venture fund called Section 32. We see the wonderful new things that everyone brings to the table as they start new organizations. And I think her comments are way too pessimistic. But I do think it's a reminder for us all that we really do have some underlying issues that we have to tackle. And I want to go through these issues very briefly as, again, to set the stage for the panel discussion. How are we dealing with technology? I actually think overall we get an A for technology. The advancements that are coming through the medical, the academic centers, industry, coming out of NIH, NCI, globally what we see, I think it's actually quite remarkable. And so I'm not convinced that technology itself is the challenge here. The question is, if we could lower the rest of the barriers, how much faster, how much shorter would the timeline be from discovery to patient impact? I think we could shrink that tremendously. Number two, clinical utility. How are we doing in developing the broad-based clinical utility, especially for the payers? I don't know, do we get a C, C+, B-? We certainly don't get anything better than a B-. Regulatory, I think regulatory is actually one of the shining stars of the past decade. I think the work that has been done certainly with Dr. Gottlieb, Dr. Sharpless, I'm sure that work will continue in the area of therapeutics, digital health, real-world evidence, diagnostics. I think they've done a pretty darn good job. I feel like they're working with us. But there still are issues to resolve. FDA approval versus an LDT. What's going to happen for the diagnostic industry going forward? Let's move to the payment side. I'll be generous and give us a D. And is it all Palmetto? Is it all national CMS? Is it the Blues plans? Maybe it's Nancy. Is Nancy the issue, or is Michael Sherman the issue? And of course not. The fact of the matter is, none of them are the issue. We can't point to a plan, to a payer, until we look around the table. Let's look at all of us. Are we doing the appropriate job working together to generate the data that we ultimately need to generate in order to justify these new expenses? Patients always get an A, but are patients being outspoken enough to really get the national dialogue focused on bringing these advancements further? I know certain groups are, and actually one of them, headed by Bonnie Adario, I think it's her birthday today, so if you see Bonnie, say happy birthday. But patients can also, I think, do more and continue the fight more broadly. On the data side, are we sharing data enough? I think we get an F for sharing data. There's so much more that we can be doing. And so I'm going to turn it over to the panelists at this point. And starting with Eric, I'm going to ask each of you just to spend a minute or two describing your organization and talk about the plans that you are putting in place to really advance care care of patients, and in some cases, just our overall health, maybe even before we are sick. And then we'll come back and dive into some of these issues one at a time. Eric?
All right, perfect. Thank you, Mike. So I'm founding CEO of Semaphore. We're a health intelligence company spun out of the Mount Sinai system about 2 years ago. And the mission is one actually geared towards addressing a lot of the deficiencies Mike just mentioned. And it's really driven by, we have this amazing technology and growth of information on the research side. And what I saw firsthand in being part of one of the biggest medical systems in the country was the difficulty in seeing that translated over onto the clinical side, so that there's this kind of this growing divide, this chasm between the clinical practice of medicine and the uptake of all of that's happening on the research side. Like, it's just a very slow process. And so why is that? I mean, certainly the payers getting stuff reimbursed is one, but the complexity of the information, how physicians can engage in that information, how they can use it in their workflows and so on, became sort of a driving force. And then how can we enlist patients in that sort of drive to close the chasm so that they're better benefiting, where I do think cancer plays a good role model for that, in that, you know, the state-of-the-art for treatment today in cancer are through clinical trials. So how can we make health systems like a Mount Sinai, where the patient population is more of like a trial population, and they're constantly benefiting from all of the technology and knowledge advances, because we're able to, through precision medicine, better assess and identify what's going on with this patient and how to best match them to the right therapy or the right trial and so on. So we're sort of on that mission to amass very large-scale, high-dimensional, longitudinal data around patients during the course of their clinical care, consenting those patients to be able to partner with them through that journey, and deriving insights from the information that's collected to guide care.
I think this will be one of the common themes you'll hear in this panel discussion. It's not just about, you know, the device, the test, the drug. It's about what are the other things that we can layer into the equation to really facilitate that data exchange with a company, with a provider, and ultimately with the patient as well. Roy?
Great, thanks, Mike. I'm Roy Smythe. I'm the CEO at Somologic, and thank you for your opening comments. I thought they were great. I was just reflecting when you were talking about, you know, the issues with healthcare, that it's not just the fact that our technologies are good, but maybe not good enough. It's also that our ability to provide access to those technologies is not all that great either. And the equitable access is obviously an issue as well. I was actually a visiting professor on this campus as a clinician a number of years ago. And even though enjoyed you know, a good career in that context, I was grossly unhappy because despite the fact that I was being able to use all those technologies, you know, and one patient at a time, I knew that the overall delivery of care was poor. And so shifted, you know, my focus to the corporate side 7 years ago to work on that project. Somologic is a company that has a chance to make progress in that area. Somologic's a 20-year-old startup in Boulder. We're a clinical proteomics company, so I'll be a little different from everybody else on the panel, a little heretical when it comes to our approach to precision health and personalized medicine. The pioneers in genomics themselves have said for the last 20 years that proteins might be a more informative source for personalized medicine biologic information, but the problem has been measurement. 20,000 canonical structures, all different half-lives, different locations in the bodies, different concentrations, et cetera, whereas, you know, the genome, once we figured it out, not that complex to measure. So we use the ability to measure thousands of proteins in the body at a time, several levels more than any other company commercially, and the patterns of protein expression to tell you things about your health, wellness, and disease states in the present and in the future, and to apply that to hopefully improving the ability to predict things before they happen, and to reach what we call deeper into the triangle, not just to focus on acute care, but to give people personal information about what they may be at risk for in the near future and alter the trajectory of their health or disease management.
Great, thanks, Roy. Steve?
Good morning, I'm Steve Kafka. I'm the Executive Chairman of Thrive Earlier Detection. And I want to start with actually a really brief history because it's apropos of what Mike opened with. I've been working in this space of precision medicine for about 20 years now. I started out at Millennium Pharmaceuticals, Raju, when you were there and part of that, and a number of different targeted therapy companies. I also then spent about 5 years working together with Mike at Foundation Medicine, building that company. And after a little bit of time off to clear my head last year, jumped into work at Third Rock Ventures that eventually led to Thrive. And I think part of that was actually realizing that all of this effort that we're putting into later stage therapeutics and even diagnostics at Foundation Medicine, chipping away, but really paled in comparison to what we can do with earlier detection of cancer. And so Thrive was founded and launched in April of this year, and our fundamental objective is to make earlier detection of multiple cancers a part of routine care for otherwise healthy people, asymptomatic individuals. And we aim to do this to really extend and save lives. The tools we have at our disposal are a simple and affordable blood test that's called CancerSeek that was developed with technology out of Johns Hopkins and Bert Vogelstein's lab. And we aim to wrap that in what we call an integrated solution so that this is not just a test result coming back in the primary care setting, but really is a way of helping the physician and the patient take that information and build it into their health program, whether that's a negative detection result or a positive detection result. And I think the fundamental opportunity that we have here is to really fundamentally change survivorship in cancer. I had the good fortune yesterday to be part of a meeting. I know Kathy Giusti was there too in New York at the Atlantic, called the Atlantic Live, the People versus Cancer. And it was a lot of discussion about cancer survivorship. And I think when you sort of look at those, survival curves, late stage versus early stage, it's a very stark difference. And I think if we can get earlier detection right, or when we get earlier detection right, we'll be talking about cancer thrivers and not just cancer survivors.
Thanks, Steve. And Nancy?
Yep. Good morning. Hi, I'm Nancy Mendelson. Thank you for inviting me and being part of this, even if I may be the butt of some jokes. That's fine. No. I am a pediatric clinical geneticist by training and did that for 30 years before joining United Health Group a year ago. For those of you that don't know, United Health Group is a very large company. Thank you. We serve about 120 million people throughout the country. We are Optum, which includes Optum Pharmacy, Optum Analytics, all the Optum businesses, as well as United Healthcare, which is the health benefits part of the organization. From a healthcare perspective, our responsibility is to ensure that people have access to proven medicine. And we have to do that based on clinical outcomes, proven clinical outcomes that show a better experience and reduced cost. Basically the quadruple aim, right? Can we get better cost, better outcomes, and better experience for a total lower cost of care? So the treatment itself may be more expensive, but if in the long run we get better outcomes and the total cost is reduced, that's what we want to do. From my own perspective, I'm not a cancer doctor. I did a lot of the Shire work with treating some of those kids with lysosomal storage diseases, and I've seen since I started this in 1987 the change in treatments and the fact that we actually can treat people now. It's incredibly exciting. And my big question is, how do we make this available to others and accessible so that people in the middle of the country, in the rural areas, can actually get the treatment that they need?
Great, thanks, Nancy. And maybe I'll start with you for a follow-up question as well. your final point is a critical one because, think about the amount of time, the amount of money that we spend just trying to get that technology into the academic center. How many of us have community physician leaders on our boards of directors or SABs? We tend not to. We have, well-established business people. We have members of our scientific advisory boards are from the top academic centers. But, certainly in cancer care, 80% of patients never make it to the academic centers. And, I start with that comment because as I think about some of the greatest challenges, 2 years ago, if I was sitting here, I would have probably listed, payment and payers in particular as 4 out of the top 5 challenges. I've really changed, my perspective has changed dramatically for a number of reasons over the past couple of years, but you're not necessarily here to listen to my perspective. I think it's the panel's perspective that's most important. Nancy, we often cite payer challenges. It's very easy on the company side to look across the table and say, gosh, why don't they get it? It's an oversimplification and probably being generous with the statement there. But from your perspective, what do you see as the gating items to really do what you said is so important at the end of your commentary there, and that is bring these technologies into patient care in the fastest and most meaningful way possible?
It's a hard question. To create some standards, to get our societies to agree upon guidelines so that we can get things implemented and have the other clinicians accept the standards. I think that's the hardest part. And I think we also have a huge challenge in educating clinicians. Genomics is, the level of understanding is very disparate in the community, I would say.
But I would say, is there not a role a payer can play? Like you sort of said, you sort of wait until all the evidence is accumulated and beyond dispute and can save money, and then you roll in. Like, is there no role for the payer to participate in helping get to that point? Like, instead of just sitting back and being the benefactor, as we have to morph into more of a learning type system where this information is big, it's complex, how physicians can engage it and so on, that's a learning we're all going to go through. And isn't there a role for payers to be participating and taking on some of that risk?
Sure, absolutely. So let me just tell you a little bit about why I came to the company, and maybe that'll be insightful. We have something called the Special Needs Initiative. It sits within United Healthcare, and that's my role, is to be the Chief Medical Officer of the Special Needs Initiative. And what we are doing is trying to provide better services for children with complex medical needs. So we've served about 100,000 people so far. We work on 4 pillars. One is insurance resolution, which I would say that's where we're the most practiced at. So if you, Mike, were to call the phone number on the back of your card and you were identified as one of those people with complex medical needs or special needs, you would get a one-to-one advisor who would take care of you and help you through the process as long as you are with the company. The second part, and they have they'll do direct contact. They will not shunt you off to someone else. And they have 56 connections throughout the enterprise to do insurance resolution, medical, behavioral, and pharmaceutical. Then there's the social determinants of health for the child and for the family. And the last part is the medical complexities. And we are right now working on a system for children that are undergoing a diagnostic odyssey, and people who travel, who are trying to find answers for their children and getting them to the right place so that we are connecting in the communities and getting to the right place so they can get answers. So that's the role we're doing right now. It's a huge effort, but I think we're making some progress.
Oh, nice.
I think that this idea of really more of a partnering approach between industry and the payers is critically important. We have to help payers get out of being in the business of saying no, right? In the business of how do we solve this together. And I think that's especially important with some of the really novel technologies, and just, to bring it home to what we're doing at Thrive, for example. Of course, there are earlier screening approaches that exist today, mammography, colonoscopy, and others. But when we're talking about using a single test for multiple cancers, that's a different paradigm. And how we go about measuring clinical utility in that setting, we can't just compare to standard of care, because there is no comparison for a multi-cancer test. And so what is the right set of performance metrics for the test itself? How do we, and ideally we come up with some common standards across payers, because as we learned at Foundation Medicine, when you've talked to one private payer, you've talked to one private payer, right? I mean, literally the goal line is very different if it's defined at all. So I think having those standards, but then also, for the performance metrics, is a really useful partnership, because that feedback to us as a company is also really going to be useful in how do we make sure that this is not just paid for, but actually used by physicians, because the physicians ultimately, need to buy into what those performance parameters are as well. So I'm happy to hear you talk about a partnering approach, because I think it, especially for these novel technologies, is critically important.
Yeah, I would agree. And just to sort of augment what Eric said, we had a conversation with a very large payer, not UHG in this particular conversation, but where we described a number of tests that we have in development that could potentially be transformational in the ability of a payer to determine how to deploy resources across populations. For example, just one example would be, we can tell you potentially the subset of type 2 diabetics that are going to develop a secondary complication in the next 3 years. And the payer said, oh my gosh, those are really compelling opportunities. That could be tremendous for us. Come back to us when you have proven clinical utility with a number of health systems. And of course, that's like, come back to us when you've climbed Mount Everest backwards. With no shoes on your feet.
that.
So, but that's the old model, as opposed to potentially a conversation that goes something like, wow, that could be incredibly valuable to us as a payer, and obviously it could be, more importantly, what we're all here to do could prevent, secondary complications in human beings with diabetes. Let's think about a way that we could work together with a handful of health systems that, by the way, are sort of beholden to us because we're their primary payer, to create a way to quickly get to the answer of whether or not this has utility. So I would agree that this sounds wonderful, the concept.
I don't think we can say, we're going to partner and we're going to do this and we're going to implement it, right? I think we have to have the clinical research, the implementation research, to be able to understand it. So we have a whole,
Of course.
Yeah, we have a whole research and design part of the company that is working on many of these efforts.
And I would say one of the, so the partnership is a good one, but I would say one of the things we're doing at Semaphore to help build up, kind of democratize the ability to build up the evidence that you need to convince across multiple health systems. So one of the things we do in engaging patient during their standard care. So take a reproductive health effort. So a woman becomes pregnant, she gets a carrier screening test, we perform that test, but we also onboard that person through digital engagement, doing the counseling. We're forming a partnership with that patient, they consent onto the system. So now we have, and they consent when you're that kind of partner very broadly to collect information. But now we can leverage that patient longitudinally to say, so consider either assays Roy would run or Thrive would run, or that we derive from the electronic medical record. So now we can build models that predict things like what are the complications of pregnancy, like gestational diabetes and perinatal depression and hemorrhage and preterm birth. And as we have models that beat standard of care, we can now do prospective studies, right, in these patients as they onboard into the system, because they're onboarding at the beginning of the journey. We can register that trial as a clinical trial, but it's all digital, right? Doesn't require any real money. We're just tracking the progress of that patient. Did our model outperform standard of care in a prospective way to say we predicted a patient was at high risk for preeclampsia, eclampsia, and they did it in that accuracy. Our PPV was 3 to 5 times what the standard of care is, and that was prospectively demonstrated. So I think that kind of engagement, I think engaging the patient in that way, having access to the longitudinal records, being able to apply sophisticated analytics in that setting, and doing the proofs of concept, because we're getting patients from many different medical systems, and so we can, so we can be demonstrating across multiple systems the impact of that prediction on their course of care and outcomes.
I think what's really fascinating about this panel is that if we were sitting here just several years ago, the CEOs, chairman, leadership of any company whose primary product is a diagnostic test would simply be talking about their diagnostic test. It's just not what you hear anymore. And I think what we're hearing from Nancy as well is the other reason I'm optimistic is that we are starting to, there's an acknowledgement that, these companies it is truly impossible. I don't care how much money a company raises, they cannot do it on their own because we need that feedback because as Steve said, there are in fact so many different, so many different customers. I would say not even one payer to another payer is different, but the various plans are different within each payer. So this cooperation is critical. A challenge, though, is if I'm sitting in Nancy's shoes or Michael Sherman's shoes. I was at a meeting with a bunch of CMOs and CFOs from a broad range of payers across the country just a couple of weeks ago. And the challenge becomes, okay, we want to collaborate. Michael said this in our board meeting yesterday. We are partnering. Nancy has been working with the Personalized Medicine Coalition on various projects. But one payer can't get bombarded by 100 different companies who want to work on data together. So thinking about, as I think, especially, Steve, Roy, and Eric, as I think about your comments, how do we set it up so we don't have to go to each payer and say, hey, let's put a collaboration together. What are the things that we'd like to see from them that are practical that they could bring back to their teams and say, hey, we're not going to embark on 100 different collaborations this year, but we should do this. Suggestions?
Well, one thing I would just throw into the mix here is that I know we're going to get to regulatory, but I think that the regulatory framework has a role to play here too, okay. and how we sort of tap into an FDA approval process as at least part of establishing the clinical utility argument is an important discussion to be having. That said, I think that there's opportunity to really design almost like demonstration projects or evidence generation projects that don't have to be huge and that in and of themselves don't have to sort of solve the bigger picture problem, but that can answer that on a population specific basis or on a geographic specific basis. That's important to.
Do you think there's a role for the government to play here?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, certainly our experience at Foundation Medicine with utilizing the parallel review process and where, in fact, FDA approval and the CMS NCD were reviewed at the same time is a paradigm that, I'd certainly like to see the government utilizing more. But then the question becomes, like, how does that become a connection point to the private payer world? We'll not to get into the minutiae of this, but it gets even more complex when we start to talk about screening, because there's this whole other agency that no one's ever heard about in the government called the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force that issues guidelines around screening that are not only for medical practice, but actually are related to payer coverage requirements as well under the ACA. And so it's gotten a little more complex as we get more innovative in the early stage disease. So short answer to your question, yes, Mike, there's certainly a role the government should play here too.
Well, I think there's that kind of role, and that maybe this is be the naive gut response that I shouldn't say. I'll say it anyway. Is that, yeah, too late. Is how to stay out of the way. Like, I think it's like the one thing that's impressed me with these kinds of technologies is in that the government is FDA wanting to exercise oversight over LDTs. Something that's been a mainstay of medicine for a long time is that technologies like next-gen sequencing, right? It's the only technology known to humankind to be moving at a super Moore's law speed. So all the technological advances you've seen over the last few decades have been like amazing, from cell phones to digital cameras and so on. NGS is moving faster than all of those. So the level of disruption in our ability to predict and so on is just, you can't predict. And so we have to be able to accommodate, again, this chasm between the research and clinical. Like, the only way you close that is to be able to take up more easily from the research and show it in practice and get it in play in a clinical system that's willing to be a learning-based system. And you can't have regulatory in there trying to play a role too early. I think there's ultimately a role in getting this as standard of care and so on, but it can't be inhibiting the ability to do the demonstrations.
Yeah. One of the problems is discernment. And, when I was my last job inside of healthcare was as chief innovation officer of a big health system, and so every week I got 3 or 4 pitches. This is sort of at the sort of front end of the digital explosion. 6 or 7 years ago, 10 years ago, when there were hundreds of these digital healthcare companies being created. And it was literally impossible to know in that position what was good and what was crap and what was really well funded and who was a charlatan and part of the problem now that we're
Sounds like being a venture capitalist, though. It's,
well, that's the issue. So,
Right.
one of the issues that frankly that we this is the the yin and the yang of a free enterprise system, right? So one of the problems that payers have and that investors have is and that health systems frankly have when dealing with people like us is there are hundreds of us talking to them, pitching things, and how do you know which ones to bet on? Because you can't run trials with 400 omic companies. And so it's a challenge. And I don't necessarily have a solution for that. I could dream up some things, but it's hard. And we have to recognize that discernment in deciding which horses to bet on. It's easy for us to sit here and say, gosh, you should really partner with us. But what she's dealing with is there's 4 of us a week coming into her office asking to partner.
So let's dream up some things then. And but maybe before we do that, Roy, I want to ask you a question. Did your previous role have an influence on your pivot for SomaLogic? And I kind of feel like you guys aren't going directly into the payer community. You're finding other other avenues.
My previous role as a chief innovation officer?
Chief innovation, right.
Well, I would say my previous role as chief innovation officer had a big impact on my personal pivot.
Okay.
In that.
We need a couch for that discussion.
Well, yeah, we do.
We won't go there.
What I realized after 2 years of trying to fix healthcare from the inside out was that I thought it was probably impossible. So for those of you that are still working on the inside, God bless you, or supreme being of your choice bless you. It's hard. I thought I had a better chance on this side to help you from this side. So, no, when we talk about regulatory, we can talk about the issues for a company that's, listen, the genomics companies are still sort of navigating the regulatory landscape. Imagine what literally the world's, we sort of consider ourselves the world's first, commercial clinical proteomics company is going to need to navigate.
Yep.
So by necessity, we have to enter the market if we choose to enter the market quickly as an LDT CLIA company, and then work with the FDA on creative solutions. But I'm sure we'll get to that as we talk about regulatory.
So Nancy mentioned the word standards. Standards came up in our discussion at a dinner last night. Standards came up in our discussion yesterday at the PMC board meeting. You've already heard a couple of other folks on the panel mention standards. I think of standards and I think of the data that's available, and then you said let's kind of think about some other ideas. Might the government have, would private payers welcome government to get involved here? And as I think about government, I think back to Vice President Biden and the Moonshot Initiative. And, after years of analysis, after his son passed away, he met with so many folks in this room. He brought hundreds of people into D.C. He didn't come back and say, well, we have to invest more in this therapeutic. We have to put more money into the NCI. We have to put more money in diagnostics. We need digital health. He said, we have to share data. I mean, that was, in my opinion, that was the basic conclusion. And I still think that's kind of the right theme for this industry, is finding ways to more appropriately share data. I think you see companies doing that, and I guess, Nancy, how do you think about the sharing of data, and what are some of the maybe crazier things that we could do in order to really foster that at the national level?
So this is my opinion, I would have to say, not other companies, but I think cystic fibrosis is the perfect example.
Okay.
Cystic fibrosis is the disease where people have shared the most data. People that work on cystic fibrosis in the foundation and in the different centers across the country, they are transparent. They share all their data, they do the PDSA cycle, they improve, they've got therapeutics, and it's because they've shared so much of their data. And I think, we are not going to move medicine forward unless we all begin to share more of our data.
So maybe it's not necessarily government, but it's MMRF, and it's
It's all-
GO2 Foundation,
it's
and
all
maybe
of
there's
us,
patient advocacy as well. Okay.
Well, I think, and I would say, Mike, it's not just sharing of data. It's like when I think of a big system like a Mount Sinai or a big lab company like a LabCorp, like the one thing that impressed me about LabCorp is they're doing 500,000 tests a day. Like, it's amazing. And they collect lots of biological samples on those patients, and they generate lots of data. And they, within 7 days, are throwing those samples away. And wouldn't, Roy, you like to have 500,000 samples a day on patients hooked up to medical records and the lab results to be able to start prospectively? Like, so maybe that is a government role, like maybe mandating, like those samples, like it is empowering back to the patient. I think, can patients be more involved? One of the comments you made, like, is there a way to empower patients to have control over who has access to samples being collected on them or the data being collected on them? Like, shouldn't they have a right to own the data and the samples collected on them and have a say in how those get leveraged? And could we set up a big repository, and I'm dreaming at this point, so, set up a big repository, national center, whatever it is, that any Somologics or a Semaphore or a Thrive can run against those samples, a lot of them being, again, perspective, 500,000 samples a day, covers 200 million people in the US, hooked up to medical data, would be transformative, for sure.
I think the best thing the federal government could do around standards, and of course there's all this intermediate stuff that is important and protective, and I don't think any of us, it was funny, I was a member of the Texas Medical Board when for those of you that followed the Texas stem cell debacle, I was actually a brand new member when the Texas Medical Board voted to support the company initiative in Texas where there was no regulation of selling stem cells, and I was the only medical board member that voted against it. For some reason, I wasn't reappointed by the governor to be on the medical board. But so, I don't think any of us disagree with the concept of regulation and the protections and all the standards that are built in. But to me, the one thing the federal government could do to make all of our lives dramatically easier is flip the reimbursement system so that providers and health systems are incentivized to be paid for clinical outcomes. Not just short-term clinical outcomes, but clinical outcomes over time. And if that were to happen, then all the things we're talking about, databases and sharing data and paying attention to genomic risk and proteomic risk, all these things suddenly would seem very important to clinicians and health systems, rather than, which new accoutrement to put on an imaging system so that you can bill 25% more.
And Steve, before you weigh in, I just want to mention, please hop up if you have any questions. I should have said that right up front, but just get in line and fire away. I know we don't have a lot of time left, so sorry, Steve, go ahead.
No problem. One of the things I just bring it back to the data sharing question specifically, I'm a big believer in the moonshot. I also am a believer in crawl before you walk, before you run. And because this is hard, and we'll talk more about this over the next 2 days, but the data sharing question is difficult. And just to give a specific example, one of the things that we're doing at Thrive is working together with the Geisinger Health System to engage in broad data sharing to really teach us how to use the product better. Geisinger is the source of, is the partner for running a 10,000 subject prospective study with CancerSeek. And as part of that work with them, we are also, inclusive of the health plan, looking broadly at the profile of the subjects in that study. And we are bound to learn things from not only a health economic perspective, but also from a clinical phenotypic perspective, risk factors that go beyond your age, for example, or some of the common risk factors. Many of these subjects also have genetic profiling, as part of their record. And so how can we start to, demonstrate that in a manageable set, in a manageable setting, and then as we start to, expand efforts, not just within Thrive, but hopefully it goes elsewhere too, I think there's a lot to learn from that and actually, again, demonstrate the benefits of that kind of an approach.
Sounds good. We'll start on the right.
Hi, I'm taking your advice to heart. I'm Laura Lee. I'm a caregiver for a patient, my father, who was diagnosed with cholangiocarcinoma earlier this year and had Foundation 1 testing. And despite repeated denials by United, sorry, it's not just a punchline to a joke, it's actually real,
Sorry to hear that.
was able to get on a targeted treatment, a targeted therapy. But my question is actually about access, because I'm very interested in, we come from a rural area and we had the capability and resources to get to an academic center. But when I hear you, Nancy, talk about, one of the barriers being education of clinicians, I wonder about not only the effect of denials on actual treatment, but the deterrent effect of denials for clinicians in particularly rural areas in terms of wanting to participate in this kind of medicine as opposed to the conventional therapies. And if that's something that, when you're thinking about the challenge of educating clinicians, are you also thinking about the deterrent effect of, quite frankly, the financial decisions that your company makes?
That's a really good question. First of all, I'm very sorry for your dad's illness.
Thanks.
It's a very good question, and the answer to your question is yes. In our own initiative, we are available not only to families, but also to the clinicians. So we've served an equal number of the clinicians. We're starting on the pediatric side and trying to make things more available to them in terms of insurance resolution.
The comment on cholangiocarcinoma and Foundation 1 testing or any genomic profiling, there's a bit of irony there because the incidence of the disease is quite modest, but the impact of genomic testing in cholangiocarcinoma, many of us have seen it firsthand. It's rich with targets, but there's not necessarily a single proven FDA-approved indication for that target in cholangiocarcinoma. We all know that's irrelevant, but that is one of the gating items in getting it paid for, is that there's not a direct line, but that kind of typifies the challenges in our industry, broadly speaking. Just a comment, so, yes.
Yeah, Tom Brewster at Maine Health Accountable Care Organization. I'm a pediatrician geneticist, and I've been in practice over 30 years, so Nancy could appreciate this. And at the time, the only condition picked up by newborn screening was PKU. And at that time, it was still a problem to be able to even pay for medical food. And that's still true today. And now, fast forward to today, where there's over 30 conditions. The most recent now that's been recommended is spinal muscular atrophy. And Novartis has put a price tag at $2.1 million for a treatment that has not been proven to have a positive outcome. So this is just raising the challenge of delivery and payment reform. And everybody's in a silo, but how can a drug company charge $2.1 million? I'd be very interested to see Nancy and the others answer.
Well, I'm tempted to, so I want to acknowledge the question, and I think we all understand the importance of the question. I'm not sure any of us have a perfect answer for it. In fact, I assume we probably don't. But rather than diving into that, I do think it's a topic we're going to get into in a bit more detail over the course of the day. So maybe we'll come back to that, not dismissing the question. I'm just not sure that that any of us could do it justice in that short of a time period, especially when there's time allocated for it. So I apologize for pushing it back a little bit. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Kathy Giusti with the MMRF and Harvard Business School. I appreciated your giving us an F on the data sharing side. And by the way, I couldn't agree more. So I wanted to tie your panel back to Karl Jule's panel, because I feel like I certainly in myeloma, the area that we tend to be focusing on right now is high-risk patients, because thanks to many people in this room, myeloma patients are doing much better in general. And so when you look at high-risk patients, I'm always looking at what the best partnerships are, because all of our high-risk patients are looking at immunotherapy and CAR-T. And they look at the expense of it, and we're not arguing about the pricing of drugs. It's not about that. But when Karl talked about forward-thinking registries, I think our biggest frustration is the data sharing side of CAR-T. Like, it wasn't CD19, it may not be BCMA because it may not be enduring, but how do we get all of these organizations to have some sort of forward effort that we could understand which patients are actually benefiting from CAR-T, and how do we do the correlatives to actually understand if it's not BCMA, is it something else that we could be working on together? So I'd love to hear any thoughts people have on, you don't get everything paid for if you're not sharing the data. What would that look like? And the second part, when we focus on prevention in myeloma, because it does move from smoldering to active, I think the biggest challenge we've had is every academic center has a different assay. And so we've had to create the data standards ourselves out of the nonprofit sector and bring all the centers together to try to create myeloma standards in the immune space. Is that really the best? We're happy to do it, but do we all think that's really the best way to do it? So I guess my question is, knowing where we are, and I think working in anecdotes in certain diseases and being able to share with you where we are sometimes gives us the best advice on what partnership models might look like, because we're really happy to partner. We don't always know exactly the right group to go to and to take a stand on things, but if you have thoughts, we'd love to do it much better if we can.
So I might say one thing. I think back to what Shire Pharmaceuticals did many years ago. And initially with lysosomal storage diseases, kids with Hunter syndrome, we thought there were, big papers for 12 kids. And they created a registry, and now they have over 1,000 people. We've learned so much from creating a single registry with the information. Wherever you can get it done.
Yeah, wherever you can get it done, unfortunately.
Well, I would say the one model we're pushing very heavily on, again, is one of empowering patients with their information. Like, if you can facilitate the transfer of, as a company that's doing the genomics on the test, and some of that will inform on the immunotherapy side and so on, in addition to the medical record and the physician notes and abstracting from that, and being able to provide that to patients, and then maybe the partnership with the private foundations is, every patient that's rolling through what we're doing has their data, and they can share that data. We facilitate the ability to share that information with whomever they want. And so who becomes the sort of Facebook-like effort, and maybe that is a private foundation that the patient's going to trust, that if they put all their data, that they get through that kind of channel. So I think in government plays a role in that too, because these meaningful use laws, I think those should be strengthened. I think the patient, again, should have access to the data they're paying for.
Good morning. Catherine Phillips, UCSF. We talk a lot about payers, but there's a new game in town, LBMs, lab benefit managers, who now manage 3 of the 4 largest insurers in the U.S. manage genetic testing for payers. And in some cases, these LBMs do the coverage policies now. And people haven't even heard of LBMs, and they're playing an increasingly important role. And Pat Tverka, who's over here, and I just recently wrote a paper in Health Affairs on LBMs. So we really need to realize what's going on out there, and payers are still important, but we have a new player in town that we need to pay attention to.
Great, thank you. Comments?
For the previous question, just made me think about something that I'd just like to make a quick editorial comment about. That is, in this role as CEO of SomaLogic, this is the 3rd and I've only been in this seat for 11 months. This is the third Precision Medicine Personalized Health conference I've either been a speaker or a panelist at.
See, Roy, we can
last
tell
year.
you're new. This is the only one.
I understand.
This is the only
This is by far the best.
Thank you.
And I've only been here for an hour, but it's obvious. But you know, there's been there's the discussion, the preponderance of the discussion about diseases has focused on cancer and a lot of discussion about, you know, CAR T therapies and so forth, because a lot of the genomics diagnostics capabilities are located in that band of diseases, and listen, we have 200 employees at SumLogic, 75 of us are scientists. We understand the benefits of that. But you know, personalized medicine for most people is not those diseases. For most people, and I was a surgical oncologist, so I took care of those diseases. And if you've got one, it's very real and very personal. But for most people, personalized medicine is cardiovascular disease, and COPD, and complications of diabetes. And so you know, our platform, while we do work in oncologic diseases, because as it turns out, protein signatures are present in those, as you might imagine, I do hope that, you know, pushing forward, thinking about how we treat people in a personalized way, that we push the envelope to think about the mundane diseases that are killing most Americans. And we're focusing on a broader range of those, because as it turns out, you know, we're not forced into that narrow band of things that genomics currently has most of its utility in, and of course it's going to push beyond that over time.
Yeah, that's an essential point, and I guess my hope is that lessons learned in personalized medicine and oncology will apply to other areas. It's my hope, and I think it's something we should all strive for. Let's try not to repeat the same things over and over and over again, but let's learn from them. But it's an essential point. Yes.
Just a quick 10-second acknowledgement of the previous question on the LBMs. And I know my head of the oncology business and the reproductive health business for Sema4 here, huge, it is a huge source of anxiety. And like we are feeling that 100%. So it is, maybe we can link up afterwards on that.
Ed, you can't get up? No, you can't. Do we have time for a couple more questions? Okay, great.
Oh, good.
Two
Sorry,
more.
one more. Ignore the clock. Blake Long from Alpha 10. I want to go back to the comment about discernment and the investor. I think one of the other barriers or concerns is a lot of the players, incumbents, insurers, big health systems, and potentially even some of the investment community is relatively risk averse. And so how do we actually shift that risk aversion to think really more like true discernment and investors and quit repeating the patterns that have gotten us to this point? Any comments about that?
I mean, I guess just I'd take a slight contrary view. I see more leaning in than leaning out, I think, from both of those constituents. I mean, sort of the major ones, payer and certainly investor. I mean, if you look at, I think, Mike, you alluded to this in some of your opening remarks, but where diagnostics is today relative to where it was 10 years ago or even 5 years ago is very, very different. And diagnostics companies have been successful, have returned money to investors, have brought value to patients. And so there's a little bit of like, we don't want to miss the bus on the next one too. So I see it actually a little bit more leaning in than leaning out, honestly.
Nancy, did you have a comment?
No.
Okay. Just to support Steve's comment, this meeting I alluded to from a couple of weeks ago, where I don't know if it was a CMO or the president of a fairly large payer mentioned, she said, well, what are we supposed to do? All these companies come in and we see 5 companies a week, and how do we know? And I think it's a practical question, but the answer is probably 4 out of 5 you can dismiss in the first 30 seconds, okay, because you have a sense not everyone is coming in having thought through the whole solution, and I think the onus should be on that. And then, so if you narrow it down to 1, I think a little bit of diligence can kind of get you to, can help you identify the companies that actually sound like they know what they're doing and companies that might in fact make a difference. But the onus is on every one of us, whether it's on the venture side, you're on the payer side, if you're a health system trying to figure out what to bring in, we all have to go through that process where we get bombarded by stuff all day long and we have to figure out what should come out the end of the funnel. So I definitely push back hard on her comment. Just recognize it's not a unique issue for a payer, for a health plan administrator. It's just the issue that we all face, and maybe not.
I would validate one. I would twist it a little bit, and I agree with both of these comments that there are plenty of investors that are willing to take risks, calculated risks. But I would say that there is a nuance here, and that is that most of the investment money since CFIUS has been ratcheted up a fair bit is in North America. And because of the way that the payment system works in North America, the likelihood of being funded is greater if your product or service is something that has a short-term return. It can be proven. If you have a product or service that has a long-term health benefit return, that is more of a problem, because the countries that have national health services that are actually potentially willing to pay for that, there aren't really investors in those countries to fund your product. So there is a little mismatch there that I think that is real. And so you have to craft your story for the North American investors just right to thread the needle, even if you think that 5 to 7 years from now, most of your business may be outside of North America.
Okay, one last quick question. We'll make the answer very short, and we'll go back to the left. And if I don't make it short, then I'll be relegated to the last panel next year. So it's sorry, whoever's moderating the last panel. It really is a lot of fun, but
All right. So first of all, on behalf of the audience, thank you very much. This has been a fascinating discussion. Burns Blacksall, I recently exited a 20-year academic career to start precision medicine at a health network in Cincinnati, Ohio. Disclosure, I grew up in a single-payer medical system in Canada. And when I lived in upstate New York, my senator was Louise Slaughter, who is the author of the GINA, Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which protects current health care and employment, but not long-term care or life insurance. And so I'm a huge fan of data sharing, and we've learned a huge amount of it. But if you said we'd get to regulatory at the end, so I'm going to bring us to regulatory at the end. How do we regulate access to data? And Foundation actually has some nice publications on de-identifying data, which is great. But ultimately, a fingerprint is a fingerprint, and a DNA full sequence is way more than a fingerprint. So how do we protect the data that all of us want to use to enhance precision medicine for the future of a country which, if we continue in our current political climate, is going to be declining people their long-term care and life insurance?
complex question, but let's do our best to answer it very concisely, and then we'll wrap it up.
I'd say, first of all, my position would be that there's no way to de-identify the data. So there has to be an education component that these consents we do that try to trick people that we can protect your privacy. It's just not true. And not just with a DNA fingerprint, with your medical record, fingerprints you. So that's one. And then I think it is a government. I think it is a legislative thing. Maybe it's an expansion of GINA that prohibits that type of discrimination, because I think, in the end, it's just going to be, I think, ruled by the courts that you have no reasonable expectation of privacy around that, because there's no way to protect it, and the legislatures need to step in.
Yeah, Louise originally wrote the law. I was actually living up there and went over the law with her, and she originally wrote it for all protection, and it was stripped down to this because of other protections that other regulators wanted.
So that was a great example of where public policy has made a difference for the development of personalized medicine. And Personalized Medicine Coalition did work on that. And I'm also proud to say that one of our staff members worked for Representative Slaughter at that time on that bill. And yes, it does need to be extended. Please join me in thanking the panel who will stick around for questions. We're going to take a 25-minute break and then reconvene for a discussion of diagnostics.